I'm Dave Bridges. I'm a Missouri boy. I grew up here and spent my whole life here, except for I had some international adventures overseas in Africa and Europe during my school days. I grew up near Poplar Bluff, Missouri. Went to school there. Then I went to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and got my bachelor's degree. And then I went over to Kansas State, and went to Manhattan, Kansas, and got my master's there. And then I come back to Missouri, to Rolla, and got my PhD. And then I left for 1 year, doing a postdoc at Oklahoma State, there in Stillwater, Oklahoma. But now I'm back home, so I've been back now for about a year, working with the Missouri Geologic Survey. Now, first of all, I have to say that I'm not, as far as clay is concerned, I did a lot of work down in southeast Missouri. The clay there is a lot different from here. That clay there is a sorbent type clay, a bentonite. And so if you have a cat in your house and use kitty litter, likely that's going to be the clay that's in your house, especially if you use Tidy Cat, Ralston Purina brands. That's a Missouri clay, and that's mine there just north of Bloomfield. They have a very large production facility. In fact, in Missouri, that's the largest single producer of clay is the kitty litter factory there. So, I'm not here to talk about kitty litter. I'm here to talk about the clay mining history here in Missouri. And in particular, lovely Gasconade County. So, my viewpoint, and the thing about one of my favorite things as an amateur historian, and I also enjoy doing genealogy, I love knowing the local intuition of the history. And, you know, I won't be able to give that to you, but our later speaker will. So, but from a geologist's point of view, I'm going to talk a little bit about the geology of the clays and the clay deposits. And then basically, we'll talk about, I've sort of divided up into clay mining in Gasconade County before 1900, and then from 1900 to about the 1940s, more particularly sort of in the first part of the 40s, and then from 1940s to present. And ironically, at the survey, we have more data concerning this period, as far as locations, names of people involved from the 1900s to the 1940s, and some before. And the least we have is from 1940s to present, because what they did was, the way that the producers reported their production, it gets complicated with the landowners, also with the operators, or actually the people that mined it. And then once it was mined, it was shipped to a refractory somewhere and made into brick and other fire clay products. So that's sort of a mess, but that's one of the things that I intend to sort of sort out with our records, and preferably I would like to do it on a per county basis. I did it with granites and trap rock so far, and so now I'm doing clays. Okay, so first of all, what is a clay? And geologists have a terrible time with certain things where we use one word with two different meanings. So this is very common in my field. So one term that we use for clay is, all it does is denote a size of a piece of mineral or rock. And it's a very small one that's usually less than the size of a bacteria. Now clay stone, which is like these samples over here, they're from sinks from around here, and this is how it is as it comes out of the ground. This rock is actually composed of very small clay minerals. There are actually specific minerals with the specific atomic arrangement, and we call those clay minerals. So, what are these clay minerals? Because these clay minerals are what makes the fire brick so good. Because, for example, you could have quartz grains, sand grains, be so small they're clay size, and we, as geologists, will call them clay, or clay size, but they're quartz. So you wouldn't be making fire brick out of those, because you're making glass. So, a clay mineral is basically it could be a suspension like in a creek or in your pond where you have muddy rainwater in it. It could be a fraction of the soil. But the important thing is there's certain physical properties about a clay mineral. So what I like to sort of compare them to, and we have that fancy word there, phyllosilicates, clays have this sort of stacked morphology. So I sort of use the pancake analogy. So the actual, and then the primary compounds in the clay, or elements, are aluminum and silica. And then another thing that's in clay, which sort of makes it unique, is the actual water molecule. So the actual pancakes, the stack, if we're looking at a stack of pancakes, that would be our aluminum and silicate. And then the water sort of goes in between. So that's like our syrup and butter. And depending on the clay type is how much water, or in this case, syrup and butter, you could get in between your individual pancakes. So like for the kitty litter, for example, that's highly absorbent. So you could get a lot of water, or a lot of water in between those layers in the clays. And that's what makes them absorbent. Fire clays, not so much. The primary common clay minerals are smectites, which is bentonite, that's the kitty litter stuff, kaolinite, and another one called illite. And so where do these clay minerals come from? Most clays come from the breakdown of other rocks. It's basically, you're losing all those other elements, and all that you're left with is aluminum and silicate. So illite, clay mineral illite, is from the bottom of the ocean. Typically, when the rivers run out into the seawater, there may be reactions taking place there, or maybe even before it gets to the sea. And then you have, once the current slows down enough, the clay settles out. It's typically the illite type. Smectite or bentonite, those come from volcanic ash. And then kaolinite is just basically the breakdown of the harder types of rocks, like granites, schist, those kinds of rocks. And then specific minerals will break down and form chlorides. But the chlorides ain't really important here. So, unlike most minerals where you could get a regular microscope, put a rock underneath the microscope and see individual minerals. Because one thing in geology, we always separate the rocks and minerals. A rock is composed of minerals, each individual minerals. And all a mineral is just a homogeneous chemical substance. It has some kind of crystallinity to it, and that's all it is. But typically, most crystals grow where you can see them, just like we would see in a museum. Nice, different crystal forms. Clay minerals, on the other hand, they don't do that. They form these platy-looking minerals, again, sort of like these would be like little stacks of pancakes orientated in different directions. And if you notice the magnification, it's 4,000 times. So even a light microscope, you cannot see the individual clay minerals. It still looks like dirt. So this is an electron, scanning electron microscopic view of clay. So we can even go up higher magnification, 5,000, and then to 10,000. This is a sample from this north of here. And still, all you see is these little plates and flakes sticking out. And that's the individual clay minerals. And that's how clay minerals are separate from the other types of minerals. Okay, this is another confusing area too. What exactly are fire clays? So by definition, they have to be refractory. So by saying that they have to be refractory, that basically means they're exceptionally resistant to heat. And you can see from these temperatures here, 2,400 to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So this, you'll see why this is important in a little bit. Now fire clay, as it is, as geologists define it, is actually a plastic. And by plastic, that means it's sort of like Play-Doh. Plastic, you could sort of deform it and mold it in your fingers. But that is the actual fire clay as we define it as geologists. The important thing here is this right here, this element, aluminum. And so what's happened here in Gasconade County is, in particular the clays here, through different geological processes and weathering, the aluminum has been concentrated so much in these sink deposits that the materials have become refractory. So flint clay is there's different grades of clay. Flint clay is the lowest refractory grade, and it's non-plastic, so it's hard. And it's like this guy. This looks like a regular rock, sort of slick, has smooth surfaces that sort of separates it from the other grades that I have here. And it's able to withstand these high temperatures. So, while we're on the subject of aluminum, so as you increase the aluminum, or the weathering or leaching in these sink fills, what happens is this flint clay over here becomes all the way over to diaspore, with burley types in the middle. The miners in the old days had two different types of diaspore, the number 1 and the number 2. The number 2 was a lesser grade, and that was this mainly based on the aluminum content. The number 1, which was the primo clay, was your diaspore number 1. And that went into the high-end refractory. It's typically white, and that was your very high-end clay. So a little bit about the geology of Gasconade County. There's really not a geologic map I found of Gasconade County that we have in our files. So I sort of compiled one for this talk. And so what I would like to show you, if I can get this pointer thing to work, there, okay. So as you can see right here, I put some of the larger towns here. So not to leave out the other guys, you're not forgotten, as you will see. Bland, Owensville, and Rosebud, Drake, and Herman. These, in the early days, were important centers for clay production. So that's why I put them on this particular map. So what you have over here, in geology, we use a time scale called geologic time. And all this really is just a relative position, because in geology, certain assumptions that we make is that, for one, the rocks are laid down flat when they're deposited in some kind of basin. They're flat lying, and that the oldest layer is the one on the bottom. Sort of common sense things. And so that's what we have here. So we have the oldest ones, Ordovician, and they actually follow the creek bottoms. And then as you go towards the ridge tops, you get the younger rocks. Because again, the younger rocks are higher in the stack, the geologic stack. And one thing I want you to sort of observe here is that this green, this undifferentiated material, Pennsylvanian age, that's where most of the sinks will occur. You will actually see them in this Pennsylvania. the formation name that geologists call this is the Graben Formation. And it's in the very lowest part of the geologic column. And over here, there's a few little outcrops of Devonian Mississippian, but not a lot here in Gasconade County. So again, this sort of visualize in your memory where this green Pennsylvanian rock is. Now, one thing that geologists like to do, sometimes we call them cartoons. We like to draw these sketches that sort of typifies a type of deposit. And so in this case, this is from 1896 from a publication by Wheeler. It's one of our, in fact, it is the first publication by the Missouri Geologic Survey on the clays of Missouri. So it not only included clays around Gasconade County, but it also included some information on the ones north of the river, and then also the ones down in southeast Missouri. But for around here, this is the model that they came up with the filled sinks. So what this is the Ordovician or Oder rocks, and this is dolomite or limestone. It's sort of the rocks that when you're driving down I-44 or maybe down 50, in different parts you can see the rocks outcropping on the side and they look like these layers. That's basically what these guys are. Now, in the sink deposits, there's this very hard sandstone layer. And one thing about these sink deposits is that layer is always there. And that is really neat from a geological viewpoint. Another thing about that layer is it's typically hard. And so the early miners and prospectors, when they were walking all over the hills of Gasconade County, what were they looking for? They were looking for this rock. That sandstone would typically wetter much less than the other rocks, and it would be sticking above the ground in small rounded exposures. So when they seen that rock, they got excited because they knew that they were either standing on or next to one of these clay sinks. Now, this early idea, this here, right here, by the way, is the overburden, what miners call the overburden. That's the unwanted surface soil residuum, the other rocks that they really don't want. A good thing about Gasconade County, and especially on these higher ridges, is that overburden is thin. So, as far as for any commodity, miners, they want to know where it's at, how much is there, and then how much overburden or how much rock do they have to remove to get to the economic prize. Another thing is that another important consideration, which you're going to see in just a few minutes, is are there ways to ship, once you got your ore dug out, you got ways to ship it to your buyers? Because if you don't have the buyers, it's no longer economic. So from that idealized cross-section of the sink, this is how they actually looked like. And so what you can see up here is different grades. Different grades from the lowest, from this to Flint, to the Burley, which is the middle one, and then Diaspora grade 2, and then 1. Now what you're looking at here, although this is from Maurice County, don't shoot me, but you got different cross sections here. And what the geologists did was they hand augured to test where the different grades of clay occurred at in the sinks. And rather than that idealized model that we just seen, you can see it's actually quite complicated. In this case, the lowest grade, the Flint fire clay, is always next to the wall rock. And that's what this yellow is. That's that sandstone, that hard sandstone that I just showed you. Now, here we go. This is one from Gasconade County. And here you can see this one has the overburden on it, this brown area. And again, you can see how the different grades, and so this is very variable. You can't really typify these things The only thing that you can say about these are that you find them on the ridges. They have this sandstone layer, sort of like an onion skin around the sinks, really hard, resistant to weathering, and then within inside that onion, you have all these different grades. You may not have diaspora in all sinks, but definitely the flint clay in a lot of them. Okay, so that's the geology lesson 101. So now we're going to move on to the history. Now, starting in 1900, again, our first book, before these things were really looked at, our first book or volume in the Missouri Geologic Survey was published in 1896. And that was the first comprehensive survey. It actually took them 5 to 6 years to compile this volume and publish and let the world know about Missouri clays. So, as far as Gasconade County is concerned, before 1900, the biggest problem here is the existence of the clays were known, and they were used locally. But the problem was transportation facilities. Because before 1900, to jump on the railroad, you had to go all the way up to Herman. And so for all the clay producers down here, the logistics of moving their clay from their pits to the railroad was a big hurdle to overcome. Although there was some closer up there in the town around the area of Swiss that did load it up on wagons and haul it into Herman to the railroad and then ship it out. So there was some clay production in Gasconade County before 1900. The biggest thing for Gasconade County was when the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad come in 1902. And they got it to Drake by April of that year. And across the southern portion here, and that was being it was following the ridge, it was following the economic clay deposits. So that was quite convenient. So this is a map from 1896, and these are the clay deposits, as noted. And there's actually another one up here by closer to Herman, in the Swiss area, and they didn't even plot it on this map, but it was mentioned in the text. So again, these deposits were known, but there wasn't a way to get them to the market. Now, one thing, while we're looking at this map from 1896, we have the Frisco down here, and you can see how the developed clay pits follow that railroad. So there's a very intimate relationship between when the railroad would come in and when all of a sudden something would become economic and you can make money. And one thing about the people back then, they were very resourceful, and that there was a way to make money, they took advantage and did it. So, within our records, we have some limited records of different names of people who had clay pits. Now, some of these names are the actual landowners, some of them may be the operators, that is the people that actually mine the clay out, and then although I don't think there's any in this list, later on, some of the large refractory factories that make the fire brick, that they actually owned and bought their own pits and operated them. So again, a large part of them was in the Owensville area. And then this is the area between Herman and Drake that they were taking some clay also from. And in this area, they were hauling it to the Missouri Pacific Railroad and transporting it out. But down here, it was mainly being used locally. So this is a typical deposit. And again, this is from near Drake. And also, this comes from the old glass type photograph. So these are really old, pre-1900. And this is a typical deposit they actually would call this a clay bank because it's sort of on the side of the hill. It's not the typical pit. And this is an interesting deposit. One thing that you can notice here is that the clay is very light colored compared to the overburden around it. Here's another pit up there in the same area. And again, these were closest to the railroad, and this is probably one of the reasons why we have pictures of them, because our geologists came up, probably got off the railroad there at Herman, and then come down and took these pictures when they started doing their investigation of clay here in Gasconade County. So here's some pictures that were just supplied to me today by Lois, and these are really neat because this typifies, and again, this appears to be pre-1900, although based on the fact that there's a railroad, I'm not for sure the next picture, I'm not for sure if this is the same tram line. But if it is, then that would put it after 1900, of course, because the railroad did come until then. But as far as getting the clay out of the individual pits, at that time, it was all did manually with picks, with wheelbarrows, or the larger operations would have these little narrow tramways. They would put it on cars and then use mules or a team of horses to pull them up and out of the sink. It was very hot. This is like a parabolic dish, especially when you're working in the summer. They didn't really much work in the winter. It was a rough day's work. And here, what they're doing is they're loading the ore from these cars up here and getting them over to the railroad line where they're being shipped up. And our next speaker, he's going to talk more about these pictures. So the important thing with these clay pits, especially at this time, was the transportation issue. You had to use horse and carts or teams and get them to a railroad, and then they could go to the market where they need to go. And this is an important aspect of the pre-1900. So, how was this stuff actually used in its day before 1900? The biggest thing that you can see here is the building brick. Yeah, they use fire clay for building brick. It works just fine for that too. Sewer pipe was a big thing. The old clay pipes that they used to use. That was very popular. And then here's the fire brick. This is for the whole state, so it's not just Gasconade County, but I do have some figures for just Gasconade County here shortly. Burnt ballast, I'm not exactly for sure what they did with the burnt ballast. I'm thinking that maybe what we call now is grog. And so they would take the fire brick, after it was vitrified, then they would grind it up into little bitty pieces. And then when they're making pottery and other clays, such as pottery clays, they would mix it. And what that does is it helps reduce the shrinking when they're firing the pottery. Because what happens is if they shrink too much, they're going to crack in the kiln. So they would actually put little pieces of fire brick, mix it in with the other types of clay, and they were able to make the pottery that way and avoid the cracking. Paving brick. Back at that time, around the turn of the century, paving brick was a big thing. They also made it out of granite, and they made it out of a rock called trap rock. But this is like what they used to pave streets. That was very popular around 1900 and 1890s, and even into the 20th century, the paving brick. Now, one thing about the building brick, you can see there's a large disparity here in building brick. So with building brick, it's sort of neat because Missouri did not look the way that it looks now. back in 1900. A process that we now call denuding. Most of these trees were not here, but people used them. They used them to heat their homes and to build their homes. But around 1900, there was not much trees left in this part of the state. And people were having problems with attaining all the wood that they needed. One of the things, the people that had some money, what they were starting to do was build their homes out of brick. If you had a house built out of brick, you were somebody special. And again, what helped this market was there just wasn't a lot of trees, so people had to start using brick to build homes. And then the rest of the stuff is like flower pots. They did not make those around here. A lot of these terracotta is like the gargoyles that they used to put on all the corners of the buildings. And the intricate designs, they were terracotta and stoneware. Most of this stuff is made from the southeast Missouri clays. And then much of this stuff, especially these guys, were made with the clays like from here in Gasconade County. So, being the importance of bricks at this time, in 1891 there were 2 brickyards in Gasconade County. And they were both at Herman. Again, that would sort of make sense because that's where the railroad was. They could ship their bricks out. And then there was 4 kilns. Each of the brickyards had 2 kilns. And those are basically, those are the ovens that they use to bake the brick. And what happens when you put the brick in the oven is the crystals, the clay minerals recrystallize and become very, very hard. And that's basically how they make bricks, is just by heating them up. And the clay minerals, they recrystallize in there and become very, very hard. And again, I put the railroad in here because that's why they were there. These are the names of the owner, Charles Hanson and F. Valet. Now, depending on some places, I've seen his name spelled with 2 T's. So if it's, as this is more of a French origin, Valet, and if there's 2 T's, well, it's somewhere else. So I'm not for sure what his last name was. Here's the common brick size of the day. 8 5/8 by 4 1/4 by 2 1/4. It hasn't changed much. This was just a good size to work down. The masons were comfortable with it. So this is a ported building made from the bricks from the Valet brickyard. And here they used over 400,000 of them. Now, it's sort of neat. Down in southeast Missouri, there's a brick company called Caston Bricks, and some of you may have even used their bricks in building your homes around here. They're probably one of the largest brick producers in Missouri and have been. What's neat is when I seen the brick operation for the first time, what they're doing here with this hydraulic press is when they take this fire clay and they just grind it up to a fine powder, and then this big hydraulic press here actually stamps out the bricks, and they're very, very hard. It's many thousand pounds per inch. You can actually pick those up and they stay together. And what they do is, you can't see it, but in front of you here, there's like a little tram line, and that's going into the oven. And so they have to pick up each of these bricks and stack them on a pallet in such a way that there's a space between each brick, so that the heat can get in between the bricks, and so that the bricks can get vitrified. And so typically, when they're going through the oven, it's a process that takes about 2 to 2.5 days. And the pallets of bricks are constantly moving at a slow speed through these long tins. And by the time they come out on the other side, they have cooled down enough to where there's no shock from the cool air, and you have finished bricks. And it's just a continuous process. And so these guys, this is really, really hard work. From what I've seen in the Cape Girardeau plant. And it hasn't changed much. It looked the machine that they were using, they were coming out 5 at a time. And they had a couple of guys, just like these two, manually taking them off the press and stacking them on the pallet as it was going. It's really neat. And what this is after they would grind the clay, they wanted to keep the water off of it, otherwise it would turn to mud. So this is a long shed, and you may have seen some of these around here, and they stored the clay in it. Mounds of clay. And then right here would be the press, a hydraulic press. And then you can't see it in this picture, but the ovens, it was sort of like a early manufacturing line. Now down here, a lot of those bricks that you see in St. Louis, in the old, especially in the old North City, St. Louis, they were made out here or north of the river in Mexico or Fulton, Missouri. And those bricks have actually been sought after by collectors. There's antique brick collectors, believe it or not. And so, in fact, there was one building that they went after so much, all that was left was the facade. It looked like a building from the street. And, but when you walk behind it, it was just a wall. All the rest of the bricks were gone. And so, that's a problem up there now. But this is a neat little video, and if you want to see me afterwards, I can give you the link. I think it was done on PBS, where a guy was talking about this and how these people were seeking these bricks in St. Louis. It's actually pretty interesting. So, now we're going to jump from before 1900 to 1900 and 1940s. Again, the Chicago Rock Island Railroad, that was what opened up this county to clay mining. And all of a sudden now, Gasconade County jumped up to be one of the largest clay producing counties in Missouri. Another interesting thing about this area, in the surrounding counties, which we call the Southern District because it's south of the Missouri River, so Gasconade County is right in the middle, and each of your neighbor counties are included, and that's it. The diaspora was located either in Phelps County or Crawford County, one of those two counties down there. Diaspora was initially discovered there around 1918. And that's the high alumina one, and the one worth a lot of money. At that time, they started looking for it up here, and it did not take them very long, and they hit a gold mine. And literally, they found a lot of diaspora clay pits up here. And that, again, further enhanced the economic, it was like an economic boom. A neat thing about this, when this happened, Gasconade did move to the first on the list of Missouri County producing clay, period. And also, the state as a whole, as compared to all states in the Union, some years Missouri was the top producer of clay, or the second most producer. And we're still hanging on to that second most at this time. So this is from a publication in 1943. This was all the clay pits that were known at that time. It was 300 and something clay pits. And it's a little bit hard to tell if I leave all this background stuff on, but what I want to show you is, if you look at this area, this is that Pennsylvania. And you can see that most of the little symbols are on this Pennsylvania surface. And if I take that away, so that's a lot easier to see, and then I labeled each of the towns, so they're a little easier to see. But look at the diaspora up here by Swiss. There was a lot. And another thing, the ones with the open circles are basically the pits that have already been exhausted. And you can see most of them are up here because these were the ones that were initially, they were taking the stuff to Herman and loading it on the railroad. So there was a lot more empty pits by 1943 than down here along Rosebud, Owensville, Bland. So again, that's pretty neat. And again, this is indicative of that pre-1900 activity. So here's some landowners. These were Pacific ones mentioned in our records. The Walkins, they had a pretty big mining operation. They actually had several pits. The Corps did too, south of Owensville, and again, this is how they spelt it. It probably should be Moha, M-O-H-A. I've seen it both ways. So this is the correct. Okay. This is the Missouri refractory pit. So this is one of the large refractories that this is now, they're showing up in these lists because they're actually just buying the land and buying the pits themselves. And here's some more. So for the genealogy interest in the group, I put these here because if you own land, likely at one point it's been mined, and you already know that because there's a big hole on your property with water usually. So the Great Fishing Pond was probably at some point formerly a clay pit. So here's the actual operators. These are sort of the big guys where once they would dump the ore on, get it loaded on the railroad, it would go off to these places. A couple of these are still in business, although now these two have just recently merged. That's sort of an interesting story I'll tell in just a minute here, but these are the other ones that have either had clay pits or a refractory operation here in Clay County. Again, this is up to the early 40s. Okay, so for statistics of all those little points that you see mapped out there, 234 was the lower grade flint fire clay, 153 were the higher aluminum grades, the Burley and Diaspora, number 1 and 2, 153 of those. So at this point, they knew 387 clay pits. That's a phenomenal number from 1900. And that just shows you the power of the railroad and what kind of economic booms it can bring to the areas once they bring it in. So for Gasconade County, the total production in 1922 to 1941 time frame, it was almost 400,000 short tons. That is a lot of clay. And value, I did not adjust this value for our current dollar value, but almost $2 million worth. If I was to adjust this, it would be about, from this time period, although because of the depression it varied greatly, it would be by a factor of about times 13 during this interval. So that was a considerable economic impact for Gasconade County, clay mine. And then this is the total production of flint fire clay from 1910 to 1941. Nearly 1,500,000 short tons, valued at 2.7 million. So that, at this time, this is a lot of money. So here's some more statistics, production and value of flint clay. Now this is included not only Gasconade County, but it's also including the neighboring county, just the neighboring counties, Osage, Maries, Phelps, Crawford, and Franklin. One thing I want to draw your attention to here, one thing that I learned about Gasconade County is you'll notice a big dip here. Well, now I sort of understand what happened there, and up there at Herman, during the Prohibition, you know, the feds came in and tore up people's property and tore down their grapevines, and basically brought the economy to Gasconade County on its feet even before the Great Depression hit. But commodities are a good indicator of a county's health. And you can see, I think this right here is definitely, it's pre-1925 and it started in 1920, going down. Again, that's the impact of that. And then over here, of course, it's quite bearable. And then this is the Great Depression time period. And then as we start to get into World War II, there's a big sharp peak. Ironically, like I said earlier, we have good data for this time period, but after this time period, it's very incoherent as far as to who produced what and where, and the way that they kept the records. And that's really unfortunate, but I'm gonna try to put it back together. So here's some pictures, and I put the approximate dates. Now this would be from old Highway 50 when it goes through Cave Hill. And what this is showing here is there's some sandstone and chert. This is from the Graydon Formation. This is that Pennsylvania formation that many of the pits originate in on the surface. And the locality, there's a neat little cave on Cave Hill that's actually one of these flint producing pits. It's not formed in the typical cave fashion that you see in a large part of Missouri. It's actually the bottom of one of the pits opens up into a passage. So that's quite interesting. So I thought I would throw that one in there. So what this picture is showing is, this is Colmeyer, so it's just east of Fredericksburg. And what this is showing is just the different layers. These are the Pennsylvanian, so this is near the top. So this is the flint clay here, the lower grade, and then there's diaspore, and then there's a mineral called boehmite. And that's a high grade, that's just another clay mineral, a different variety than diaspore. Now, this is the Quartz Pit south of Rosebud. Now what you're looking at here is, if you remember how I said that each of these clay pits, they have this lining of sandstone around them. And that's what you're seeing right here, is that hard resistant sandstone. The miners did not want anything to do with that. They just, and you can see they were actually quite efficient at getting that fire clay out. Because that's all that's there is this sandstone, and it's clean. Here's another view of that. This is straight drop. They got all the clay out there. And of course now, when this picture was taken, it was already been inactive for some time. You can see that it's starting to fill up with water. Because that's one good thing about this type of clay. It's good at, regularly, the rocks are very porous around here. If you go down there south of here, it gets very hard to build ponds because all your water wants to run out through those small cracks and fractures. You guys are blessed up here when it comes to ponds because you have all these natural ones, more or less. Now here's another one. This is the John Holt Pit, just north of here. And again, it's just showing the complicated, intricate relationship between the different grades of fire clay.
How did they separate those different grades?
It's totally by aluminum content. So the higher the aluminum, so for example, above, let's see, above 60% aluminum, then it becomes diaspore. And then
put
from
it all
40,
one big thing, and then they sifted out from that, or did they dig certain parts of it, or?
well, that's a good question. Before, the miners had difficulty separating these things out, and so when they would go to the refractories, they would get all mad. It's like, this is all mixed up, and we don't even want to work with it. So one of the things the Missouri Geologic Survey did was they went out and actually made these sets that the miners, just like what I have here on this table, it says, this is flint clay, this is burley clay, and this is diaspore. And so they actually helped in that way, helped the miners to sort it. And that actually helped the prices of the clay go up too. So here's another view of that pit. This is a pretty large pit in its day. And again, you can see the different layers in the side of it. And there's a guy down there for scale. This is one of the larger pits, by the way. A lot of them are smaller than this. This is just a large example. In fact, here's another view of it. Here's the miners down here. And again, this one is just northwest of Owensville. And again, this is around 1940 when they were doing this work. This is the out there hiding pit. This one is sort of way out there, 7 miles northwest of Owensville. And again, there was a lot of ore removed from this pit. So, how do you get clay out of a clay pit, especially like this one here, one of the smaller ones? So here these guys, there's two of them, one up here on the ladder, and then there's one down there. Typically they would work in teams. They would mine the barites or the TIF down in Washington County in a very similar way. So one guy would be down the hole, loading up the bucket. The other guy would be up here, pulling them up and getting it out of the pit. And this is sort of neat because it's very similar to the way they did TIF or barite down in Washington County. Now, as you can imagine, come springtime, there will be a lot of water in their holes. So they have to get the water out of that clay pit. So a lot of times what they'll do is back up a drilling rig and try to put a hole next to the pit and make a hole down to a layer where the water can escape. And this is how they removed a lot of the water from the pits when they were ready to open it up again. And you can see that was quite an operation. And you can see there's a family up here looking down into the hole. It's a neat little picture, and there's a couple more of them sitting there. So this one's near Bell. What they did here, again, the locals, you just improvised. They made them a boom structure here. At this time, you could find this type of boom apparatus in many of the quarries and the clay pits, and even in the granite quarries. This kind of boom structure where there's pulleys here, and they would hoist the clay out of the pit. And up here, they took an old truck, and basically it looked like there's a wheel. They're using it. They attached it to the rear axle, and they're using that to pull out the clay. So, again, they're making use of what they have. Whatever it takes to get the clay out of the hole and into the market. Now, as far as finding these things, what they did was they would use it was done basically by people that had shovels, picks, and right here you'll see it looks like a corkscrew. That's an auger. And so whenever they would find some of that rim rock, that sandstone sticking out, they would go to work with those kinds of tools to try to figure out where the hole was. And sometimes when they found the hole and they wanted to find out how much is there, they needed to go deep. And so this is sort of unique to Gasconade County in this part of Missouri. This right here, the idea of what they call a gin pole. And so as you can imagine, when you start trying to auger, if you add a 10-foot extension or even 20-foot extension to the auger, when you're trying to work it in the hole, the top part of it you won't have much control over. So what they did was they made this apparatus, which they call the gin pole. They attached the top of the pole up there at that fork, and they were able to auger pretty far down and assess the resource. It's pretty neat. And again, it's just making use. And this shows a good example. What do you not see there at that time? Trees. Now later on, this is around 1940, now they have power augers. And what they're looking at to assign these different ores is these little chips that come up from the auger. And then they would use that in some kind of, after a while, it didn't take them very long, they didn't need actual samples to look at. They knew, you know, this is burley clay. But the power tools really helped a lot with prospecting. Now here's a neat little picture, and I believe that this was taken somewhere around Owensville. This is an old schoolhouse. And I found this actually in another reference, but this was in one of our publications. The only, and I think it's in Gasconade County, the only road in the world that was surfaced with flake clay, and it's right here. Now one thing about coating your road with clay is, it's generally not a good idea. This stuff would break up, it would disaggregate, but nonetheless it was there and it was used before this gravel road, this modern gravel road was in place. So that's pretty neat, but you know, that's something that Gasconade County could claim as having the only roads that were surfaced with flake clay. I can imagine it would be very slippery when that. Okay, so through the 40s, a lot of those prior uses, the pavement blocks, they did not use them for that anymore. That was done. A big thing is fire brick during this time period. And again, the fire brick, without fire brick, we would not have iron or steel, because you have to get iron and steel very, very hot to extract the ore. And so how could you hold such a hot mass of metal? You had to have something that could withstand those high temperatures and hold it together in the container in the furnace. And, well, lucky for us, the fire brick, and a lot of the fire brick from here in Gasconade County could withstand temperatures well over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they lined the furnaces with fire brick. And of course, glass is another thing. You have to get glass really hot to melt it from the pure silica sand. And so, again, you would need to use fire brick. Cement kilns, they have to heat the calcium carbonate really hot to turn it to calcium oxide to make concrete. Again, lined with fire brick. The diaspora here is very, very red. It's almost like a cat's tongue. So at the end of the presentations, I would like you to come up and touch each of these. They're here for you to touch. And you can tell that this is a little bit different bear than these others. And again, this is very high aluminum. And this is what they would use for the very most high heat properties. Now, we're jumping to where we are today. This is just what I've been able to come up with in a short time. I found more than 630 clay pits. So basically, they almost doubled. And you can see the patterns, they sort of follow where those green areas were. Now, of the 630 clay pits that are known here in Gasconade County, these green spots show the active ones, and I came up with 47 currently active clay pits. And I got these from another part of the DNR that handles land reclamation. They have to file for permits and all that stuff, so this part was pretty easy to find. So there's 47 currently actively mined pits in Gasconade County. Now one little story for you guys. Down here, in this location, this is off of F Highway, I think it's Gaddy Road, if I remember right. There was a house and there's a big pit in their front yard now. So what happened was in 2010, the title of their land, the mineral rights got severed. So a mining company was able to come in to their front yard and drop a clay pit right in their front yard. They had to move their driveway to the other side of it and come around to their house. So if I was you guys, I would be checking my quick needs and my abstracts to make sure that you still have the mineral rights to your property if you don't want this happening. Because I'm sure the way it works in Missouri is once you buy a piece of land, it is yours. The trees, the surface, and what's below your feet. However, what people can do is they can sell the mineral rights. And when you do that, it's called severing the mineral rights. And then somebody else you can sell that to, they actually get a deed also, but it's for the mineral rights. And the mineral rights laws, you have to give easements and right-of-way so they can just come right in, get to their deposit, and get their clay out. And in this case, it took less than a year, and they made a big hole, they got their clay out, and then the land reclamation made them fix it back to the way it was, with the exception, they even put the grass back around it, with the exception of they didn't have to fill a hole in it. And so now they have a big pond in their front yard. So, anyways, just a little story that I would, I know for sure if I lived on land where there might be some of these, I would want to make sure that at some point in the past, one of the previous owners of my land did not sell the mineral rights, so I would have some kind of nasty surprise in the future. Because these clays now, or especially now with China coming in as a big consumer, India coming in, the prices are going up, and that means people are going to be looking. So, again, you want to make sure that you understand about the mineral rights in your property. So here's the current operators. These are the people that make the fire bricks or the different products. And AP Green is now merged with Harbison Walker. Harbison itself has been in Gasconade County almost from the very beginning. I think that where that clay was taken out on that property that I just told you, I think it was, they are the ones that got the permit on it, so that's where it went to. This company here is from Chicago. Again, that's not what was, again, the difficulties of tracking clay now is being that the clay is being used in Illinois, that Illinois is getting the credit for the clay. So we don't even have this company in the list that's given to us by the USGS. We don't even have that as a clay producer, but I dug it up nonetheless. The last two are big cement producers. This Continental's up here by Hannibal, so I know that one's a pretty big operation. So you may be asking, well, what does cement have to do with fire clay? Well, because of the high aluminum content, when you make cement, you take the limestone, you cook it, it turns to calcium oxide. Well, to get cement, you have to have aluminum. So aluminum is actually the hardening agent. And so they use this clay. And they have been using it for many years. So they add it, and then they heat it up and then make it into little pellets and then grind it, and then it goes into the bags or to your local cement company. So this is very important. These sinks are very important even for cement. So again, the current use is fire brick, and here's the grog. And it's actually reported as grog on our list. And again, that's the stuff that they mix in with the other clays to make them more hardier when they're firing them in the kiln, so they don't disintegrate. Portland cement, which is just your typical cement, and they also use it to make tile. So possibly, if you have tile in your bathrooms or your kitchen or throughout your home, you might have some Gasconade fire clay mixed in with your tile. So, coming to, going back to WW2, these are just some interesting places where Gasconade clay ended up. And these Liberty ships were very important for the war effort. We needed to get supplies over to our troops, fighting the bad guys. And these ships here were built specifically, all this space in here was nothing but holds, storage holds for supplies for the war effort. And the motors that use these things, the oil burning boilers, they were lined with Gasconade fire brick. Gasconade County fire brick was used in these and other U.S. warships during World War II. So Gasconade County also contributed to that effort, along with our other Missouri fire clay counties. So as of 1967, again, this is a spotty figure, 52 active pits in 1967. It's not very much different today. We're only 5 down compared to 1967. So what that sort of tells me is that the clay market is healthy and stabilized here in Gasconade County, and they're still finding the pits. Again, in 67, Gasconade County produced more than any other Missouri county. And then between 1952 and 1967, again in the Southern District, Gasconade County, and that's with all those other surrounding counties, 86% of the clay was produced. So all the other counties combined, it was only 14% of your surrounding counties. So, now you're wondering, why do I have a Saturn V rocket on your screen talking about clay? Well, would anybody like to venture a guess? Yeah, right down here, you'll notice a flame trench. You know, when these things took off, they shot flames high over here. So the flames would come out of this fire trench, hit this reflector, and sort of go up on this side. They had another one on the other side, so when it was going up, you would see these high flames coming out the other side. But down here in this trench, there's some Gasconade flint clay down there, basically protecting the metal gantries and all of that, protecting it from the high heat from when these things took off. Because if you remember, those of you that were around at that time, when these things took off, they weren't like the space shuttle where basically just like a second, then it was already zooming off pretty quick. This thing sort of crawled initially and getting faster and faster. So the materials down here had to be really heat resistant. And again, we have Missouri fire brick to thank for that. So, concluding, just some take-home thoughts from my little part of tonight's presentation. The clay mining is an integral part of Gasconade County history. It's very, very important. Again, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad was probably the major key to that, opening up these markets. Gasconade County helped boost Missouri as a whole in the United States to one of the top clay-producing states. And we have been ever since Gasconade started. I think last year we were second. So I can't remember. And the good thing is that more discoveries are likely in the foreseeable future. Any comments or questions? Yes, sir.
What was the wage for a worker in a pit back there in the 30s and 40s? Daily wage?
Way back then, I don't know right off my head.
I got some figures on
Yeah, so again, some of those finer details we're going to get.